Easy painting tutorial this week. We're going to be working on a still life of an apple. This is going to be about painting a sphere, meaning creating the illusion of a three-dimensional object on your canvas. There's also a decent amount of different textures in this one that can be a lot of fun to paint. Up on the screen now is a high-resolution photo of my completed painting, so if you want to paint along, feel free to use this as a reference. But even better, what I'd like to see you do is take an apple from your house and then set it on a table with a light source over to one side. And then use that as your reference, work from life. And I'll talk about the importance of life drawing later on in this video. So I'm working here on a gessoed panel. This is one made by Ampersand. It's called the Artist Panel. I drew out all of my initial lines with an HB pencil using a light amount of pressure. And the first thing that I'm going to start painting in here is the background, just to get some separation between the apple and the background. You'll see that I'm using a shield here that I cut out myself that's the exact same size as the apple. I'm lining this up with my drawing and just spraying some black paint into the background. And this is just going to give me a very sharp edge along the outside of the apple. Now there's a bunch of ways to go about doing this. You could use some Frisket film, you could print out the image and then cut out a stencil from that, or you could even use some freehand shields. As I'm spraying in this background, I noticed that this panel shows some of my fingerprints, so I should have washed it off before actually painting on it. Or better yet, I should have just made my own gessoed panel, but it's going to work fine here because I'm covering all of this background with a solid layer of black paint. And now because this is a beginner's painting tutorial, I want to add this in. Make sure you do not forget about safety measures when spraying any sort of paint with an airbrush. I like to wear a respirator when there's a lot of overspray, like spraying in this black background, and also good ventilation or something like an extraction system just to help remove that overspray from your studio. I'm using Schmincke Aero colors for this painting, and in my airbrush right now, I'm spraying the color Brilliant Red, which is an opaque color with a very small amount of phthalo green in it. That green is the complementary color to red, so it's just going to help bring down some of the saturation of the red that I'm spraying. And so the color that I'm spraying here is about 20 parts of that Brilliant Red to 1 part of phthalo green, and then about 5 to 10 parts of some white. And the white is just going to help prevent this red from getting too dark too quickly. I started out by using the other part of that stencil just to help establish that sharp edge between the apple and the background, and then I'm just going to spray some of this in freehand. And now if any of the overspray from this opaque red paint gets into that black background, it's not really a big deal for me because I could just switch over to black later on and spray that background in again. Around the stem, I'll switch over to a freehand shield that masks it off and then spray some of this red paint over to the left. And I'll continue with this freehand shield just to spray in that separation where the apple just kind of rounds over where the stem is going to be. And then from here, I'm going to start filling in the apple with a solid value of this red paint. At this point, I'm not spraying that paint at 100% yet. I'm still controlling my values by how much paint I apply to that panel. Along the right side, I'm going to switch back over to that mask and then just spray some of the paint over to the left. I don't want to spray too much because I don't want that paint getting underneath that stencil. I'll continue filling in the top part of the apple, trying to fill in a relatively even value of this red paint down. And you can see I left a gap right here where the specular highlight is going to be because I'll be erasing into that later on. I didn't mask off the stem, so there's a fair amount of overspray on this. Very easy to remove. I'm just using a soft eraser and cleaning it up. I'll put a crop section of my completed painting on the left side of the screen here. That way you can see what we're painting towards. And what I'm doing here is using an eraser to remove the paint where this really bright highlight is along the upper right side of the apple. This is called a specular highlight. And what a specular highlight is essentially a reflection of the light source. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm essentially just erasing out the center of this highlight. And as I get to the edges, I use less pressure on that eraser just to blend them out. And if you don't want to use an eraser here, you can use an opaque paint in your airbrush and spray that in. That'll work just fine as well. Once I get this area erased out, I'm going to switch over to my airbrush freehand using that same red color, and I'll start applying more paint to this apple. This way I'm going to build up to a darker value and more saturation of that red mixture. I'll be adding more of this opaque red paint later on, but before I do that, I want to add some of this texture in. You can see that there's a fair amount of these softer light spots across this whole apple, so I'm just going to use an eraser here and start drawing them in. I'm following my graphite drawing underneath that's still visible underneath the paint. It's kind of like a cheat sheet. I'm just erasing out some small dots where I see them drawn in. Then I'll continue with that opaque red mixture, spraying some of it into the center just to help darken it up, and then over to that cutout for the lower left-hand side of the apple, spray some more in there just to define the shape of it. Now it's kind of hard to see in this video, but there's a very light amount of this red overspray in the black paint just behind the apple. So I'll switch back over to that black paint. That's an opaque black by Schmincke Aerocolors. I'm spraying this directly from the bottle at around 25 psi, and I'm using that template again, lining it up with my painting of the apple and just spraying some of this black paint into the background. This is going to help to further sharpen up that edge between the top part of the apple and the background, and it's going to cover up any of that red overspray. And I want to take my time with this. I'm not just lining up the shield and then just hosing the paint out. I'm lining up the shield with a small part of it and then just dusting on some black paint. And then I'll remove the shield to see what it looks like, just making sure that I'm not spraying too much so that none of that black paint gets underneath that shield onto the red. So at this point, we have the apple in place and the background. We have a nice sharp edge along the outside, but you can see right here that it just looks extremely flat. It just looks two-dimensional. It doesn't look like it has any depth at all. In order to create that illusion of a three-dimensional apple, essentially a sphere, I want to start adding some highlights and shadows and of course some midtones to this apple. So the first thing that I'm doing here is starting with some of the smaller highlights along the top of the apple, right around the stem. Now, I personally love to use an erasing technique for my paintings. I feel like I get the most control that way. So I'm starting out with an eraser here just to pull out these highlights around the left and the right side of the stem. This is going to remove the paint, exposing some of that gesso underneath, giving us a lighter value of that red. It's also going to add a fair amount of texture here, so I'm erasing in small circular motions, making sure they overlap to get an even value pulled out. And again, if you don't want to use an eraser and you only want to use your airbrush, you can use an opaque paint here in your airbrush to spray in these highlights. That's fine as well. But a lighter opaque paint sprayed over this darker red is going to give you a hue shift, so I avoid all of that by using the eraser. I'll switch over to the color sepia for the lower part of this stem, use a freehand shield, line it up with the edge, and then spray a little bit of this paint over to the right. And this is just going to be a reference point for now. I'll paint this stem in later, but this is just going to help me know where the lower part of this stem is going to be, just some separation between it and the apple behind it. From here, I'm switching over to a soft eraser and just lightly going over some parts of the red paint. This is going to help lighten up some of the areas and just add that very subtle texture that you see on the completed painting. The major light source on this painting is center right, so the stem is going to have a very small cast shadow off to the left side of it. I'm going to start painting this in now, essentially just get the placement of it so that I don't get lost as I'm working on the rest of the apple. I'm using the color sepia, which is a transparent color. I lined up my shield with the left side, sprayed some paint in, and then I'll do the same thing over to the right side. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but I'm slightly elevating my shield on the right side here as I spray the paint in. That way I still get a defined edge, but it's not razor sharp. It's just a little bit softer. While I have the sepia in my airbrush, I'm going to continue using it along the stem here. You can see that there's a bit of a shadow along the left side. So I'm just spraying a bit of paint in here now just to kind of establish the shadow on the left side, and I will come back to this later to fully paint in this stem. And then I'll switch over to some black paint just to define the left side of this stem and that transition between the top part of the apple and the background. I want to show you a cool little trick that I've been using over the last month or so just to remove more paint for a brighter highlight. I'm using a soft graphite eraser here into this specular highlight, and you can see that when I touch this to the panel itself, a lot of paint gets removed. I'm also using a very light amount of pressure on this eraser, so the trick to removing paint like this is to just slightly dampen the tip of the eraser. So let me show you what I mean by that. I have a shop cloth here, and I just sprayed a small amount of distilled water into the center. And then I just dabbed the end of the eraser into that wet paper towel. It just adds the slightest amount of moisture. I'm not saturating the eraser, it's just a small amount of distilled water on the end, and you can see that when I touch it to the canvas, the paint lifts right up. Now, I don't want to smear any of this paint along the panel, so it's very important here to erase a small amount of paint at a time. Once I do that, I clean the end of the eraser on that damp paper towel again, and then wipe off any excess paint from the panel. I'm also using a drawing glove here, so I just wipe my hand across that panel, and it just removes any of that excess paint. So it is a very interesting technique to pull out a really bright highlight, essentially pure white, but you can see here that it gives you a very, very sharp edge. And a sharp edge can be helpful in certain types of painting, especially something highly reflective like chrome. But for this one, I want to just soften it up a little bit. Now, there's multiple ways to go about doing this. I could use my airbrush with the red paint, just kind of spray it along the edge to create a gradient. That would work just fine. That's the way that probably most people would do it, but I decided to use my eraser here and just erase out along that transition. So I'm using a drawing technique to blend out that specular highlight into the red paint surrounding it. I use more pressure on that eraser where it's really bright, and as I start moving my way out, I use less pressure the whole time, erasing in small circular motions. I'll speed up some of the video here because this can definitely be a bit tedious and slow going, but I'm switching off between those two erasers, the hard one and the softer one, just to add some of that texture and that gradient along that transition point between the highlight and the apple itself. And you can see what it's starting to look like here. It is still a very sharp, defined edge, but there's just a bit of texture there along the outside. So now that we have a few highlights and that specular highlight in place, I want to start adding the dark shadow on the bottom left. I'm switching back over to that slightly desaturated red color, and you can see that I'm using my shield here just to start spraying in the lower part of this apple. That's going to help me maintain the correct proportions and of course give me the sharp edges that I'm looking for. Now from here for the lower left hand side, I'm switching over to a darker red mixture. This is a dark, very desaturated red. It's a mixture of about 5 parts red to around 2 parts of phthalo green. And before I go any further to really darken up this shadow, I'm just going to make a light pass with a softer eraser around this apple. And I'm slightly lightening up the value here, but I'm mainly doing this just to add some of that subtle texture, just kind of scuffing up the paint. Now I'm going to switch over to the color black and start spraying in a bit more of the background on the left side where it transitions from the black paint to the wood texture. And then I'm just going to dust on a light amount of this black paint on the lower left hand side of the apple. This is going to add a lot of contrast, is what I was going for in this one. It's going to round off this part of the apple away from the light source, create that illusion of depth. And we still have a long way to go here, but you can see that adding that darker value on the bottom left just helps to create a little bit of depth to this painting. We're going to push it much further though. So from here, what I want to start doing is just adding in some of the background along the left side. This is going to be some very soft, almost out of focus wood texture over here. I made a mixture for this of equal parts burnt umber and sepia. Both of these are transparent paint. And what I did here was use my shield to block off the lower left hand side of the apple and then spray some of this paint into the background. The first thing that I was trying to do is to create a very soft transition between the black background and the wooden table. So I didn't use any shields. I don't want a sharp edge there. I want the airbrush to naturally blend those two values together. A lot of the wood texture down here is actually going to get covered up by the cast shadow of the apple. So I'm just going to paint this in pretty loosely. I'm just painting a few lines in using my shield and just a bit of soft erasing for some of the highlights within that texture. While I was spraying this in, I accidentally went a bit too dark with this color. So what I'm doing here is switching over to the color white to spray over it just to lighten everything up. And you can see when I sprayed this in how we get kind of a grayish look because the bluish of that white is mixing with that orange of the wood texture underneath, giving us a gray. And I sprayed this area a bit brighter than it needs to be because now I'm switching back over to that transparent wood color, spraying this right over the top. So that white helped lighten up the area that was a bit too dark and we're back to that wood color. And from here, I'm going to switch over to the color black, blend out that transition point between the wooden table and the black background. And I'm going to use this color to start painting in the cast shadow right underneath the apple. You can see that I'm using my freehand shield to do that, lining it up with the edges and just spraying some paint in there. And for the parts of this shadow that need to be soft and diffused, like on the left side, I just paint them in freehand, let the airbrush do the work for me. And so that's where I'm going to wrap up the first part of this video. We got a lot in, but we still have a long way to go to really start pulling this together. In the second part of this video, which will be up on the channel next week, we're going to be painting in all of that texture on the apple itself, creating those softer transitions in the midtones. And of course, we'll be painting in the wood texture along the right side and then just kind of correcting everything at the end. And before I go, I want to say thank you so much for the incredibly generous support of the current channel members. I'd like to welcome the newest members. That's Mike, Steve, Sander, Hangel1986, and Donnie for rejoining at Tier 3. Thank you guys all so very much. I hope all of you have a great week, get to spend some time painting or drawing, and I will see you back here next Friday. We'll be finishing this one up.